Salve omnes, welcome to this Q&A which I promised you. Except, well, it's not quite one Q&A. I got a bit too many questions and had to split them into batches. So this first part is to answer your burning questions about the general wide view of Eastern Roman history, questions which span the whole or wide period, rather than a specific inquiry into a specific event. Those are saved for the next part. And then we have three smaller parts, about questions on my historical opinions, rankings, and some about the channel itself. So the first question, as you may have guessed from the video title, is: how far did Roman merchants and diplomats travel, particularly after the early Arab conquests? Did they visit lost provinces of the empire? If so, were they aware these lands were once part of their country? Did they travel far east too, like India, Iran, China, etc.? This is a very good question, and very related to my future plans for the channel. Short answer, yes. Even after the Arab conquests, the Romans still lived and traveled to the Levant, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, and beyond. And they went as far as China. Or maybe it was precisely because of the Arab threat, which the Romans wished to circumvent, that Roman diplomatic contacts with China became much more frequent in the Middle Ages than they ever were in antiquity. You heard me right. Yes, more frequent. And this time, it wasn't the Chinese seeking to establish contact with the mysterious Dacian civilization, but the Romans in Fuling who took the initiative. We have several solidly attestable diplomatic encounters between Roman ambassadors and emperors of China, most of those in the immediate aftermath of the Arab conquests. Romans were tested in China well into the late Byzantine period, and especially as time progressed into modernity and the Chinese interacted more with the West, both sides' sense of world geography improved, and they could provide more accurate and interesting information about the other. I do plan on making future content on these encounters to deep dive into sources of both parties and assess their significance, so I won't spoil everything now. I'm sure all Romables who watch YouTube have heard to death the stories of how Zhang Qian established the Silk Road, how Han Wudi fought a war just for Greek horses, how Gai Ying almost made it to the Roman Empire, but oh no! Slimy Parthian merchants scared him off. Well, I have new stuff to offer you. Voices of the past said there was only 1,000 years of contact between Rome and China. Love that channel, but I tell you there's 1,000 more in the Middle Ages, and they merit examination, and I will examine them. With Iran and India, the contacts were more frequent, through the trade routes. The Silk Road was so exceptionally developed in the Middle Ages that medieval Romans got their hands on exotic spices from those fine lands much easier than before, as seen in how frequently medieval Romans referred to condiments and stuff such as saffron, spikenard in their dishes. Direct trade with India, which the Romans enjoyed thanks to Egypt and the Red Sea, was cut off after the Arab conquest, true. But the land route through Central Asia still was there, and some sort of diplomatic contact with India was known to be held even into the reign of Constantinos VII Porphyrogenitus. Romans in Iran after Arabs separated them can be better attested, especially in the later period. We have diplomatic contacts between the Romans and Buyids, and then later the Persianate Seljuks who became a direct neighbor. I have talked a bit and will continue to talk more in my upcoming Trebizond series about the scholar Grigorios Kioniadis, who traveled to Ilkhanate Iran to bring back Persian astronomy to the Romans. Many Romans, free men and slaves, were to be found in the Muslim world. Usually they retain titles indicating their Roman origin, and some become really prominent even, but the point is, they either traveled or were born there. So, in short, all the three places you mentioned definitely had Roman presence. Those curious bastards, born of a seafaring culture, weren't gonna let some pesky caliphate get in the way of exploration and trade. Was there ever a realistic opportunity to recapture old Rome? If not, what would have had to happen for an opportunity to emerge? When would this have most likely happened? Well, they did. Does the name Belisarius ring a bell? I suppose then you're asking about after the Romans re-lost Rome in 751. Since the Romans were always more preoccupied with closer threats, like the Arabs and Bulgars or Turks, you needed a time when the empire was seriously powerful, wealthy, prestigious, and attentive to Western matters almost as much as the ancient days of Belisarius and Justinian the Great. You have a likely shot to have recaptured old Rome. And the only instance of something close to this was during the reign of Manuel I Komnenos the Great. Manuel's empire was insanely prosperous, more so than we would generally assume to be the golden age of Eastern Rome under the Macedonian dynasty. Don't be fooled by reduced territories. The Komnenian restoration made the empire a pan-Mediterranean power worthy of its ancient self, respected by all, Holy Roman Emperor of Germany to the legendary Saladin of Egypt. To know more, do read The Empire of Manuel I Komnenos by Paul Magdaleno. And what's more, Manuel was very invested in Western affairs, be it papal controversies or crusade ventures. The relation between Old and New Rome was at its best after the Great Schism of 1054, and of all the Komneni and subsequent emperors, Manuel was the most likely to have repaired the schism and healed East-West enmity too. No emperor could hope to hold Rome without the support of the Pontiff of Rome, and how the rivalry between Rome and Constantinople contributed to no small degree to the drifting apart of the two parts of the empire. So with all these conditions, Manuel seemed the perfect candidate to become again a Roman emperor who actually possessed Rome. And the most likely instance of this may have been his Italian campaign, which was the last time an Imperial Roman army tried to reconquer their land of origin. Manuel's army was hella successful. They swept up Apulia with lightning speed until Brindisi. It was aimed against the Normans of Sicily. The local Roman majority of the south welcomed the Imperial army, but a blunder at Brindisi cost Constantinople all its gains at the heel of Italy. Still, it's hard to say whether someone as grandiose as Manuel could stop his ambitions at just Apulia. I'd say he was going for the whole Adriatic coast of Italy. And in another scenario, maybe, if things were just right, he could have retaken Old Rome. No other periods of Roman history offers even a remote possibility of that. Who is the Byzantine-era Hannibal? I'm going to assume Khalid, but maybe you have a different answer. Let's first define what a Hannibal is. A military genius, a nightmare for the Romans who almost defeated them on their own turf, yet also highly respected and commemorated long after his defeat at the hands of the Roman general Scipio Africanus. So, is there anyone like him in medieval Roman history? It's a hard question. Antiquity was the age of great commanders and great battles. We can't easily find any general with any real great battles and novel strategy like Hannibal in the Middle Ages. Personally, I'd say that despite all the praise of being a new Scipio lavished upon the Emperor Heraclius, he was closer to Hannibal in terms of strategy, audacity, and fate. Heraclius was hard-pressed by the Persians, like the Carthaginians were by the Roman Republic, and he decided to strike back with a daring gambit right into enemy territory, beating the Sasanians in their own empire, and menacing their imperial capital of Ctesiphon, like how Hannibal was at Porta's Rome. The odds of him failing and dragging with him the final legions of the Roman Empire down with him somewhere in the Persian highlands were of course far larger than him actually succeeding. Like how Hannibal Bringing elephants over the Alps could have screwed the Carthaginians over at any time. But they did it somehow, and won astounding victories, although they still lost to a new enemy. Hannibal to young Scipio, and Heraclius to the commanders of the just established Rashidun Caliphate, including your suggested Khalid ibn al-Walid. So both Hannibal and Heraclius were just, a little bit from achieving a perfect legacy. Very sad. Well, I know you expected to hear about one of Rome's enemies, so sorry if I subverted your expectations a little. I didn't mean to curse you with an image of Khalid as a Byzantine Scipio, so to compensate for that mental damage, I'll give a more conventional answer. Shah d'Anjou, the nemesis of Michael VIII Palaeologus. His life goal was to retake Constantinople for the Latins. He allied with almost all of Constantinople's enemies, Albanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, etc. He caused extreme distress to the Romans and especially to Michael, who still refused to give up and managed to catch Shah off guard by instigating the Sicilian Vespers. The Angevin imperial dream was shattered, and new Rome breathed once more. Ironically, one of the times Constantinople was literally saved because Shah was dragged on a crusade against Carthage by his brother, Saint Louis. But yeah, it's hard to find exact parallels. This is the best I can do. How did Byzantine attire evolve over the 1,000 years of its existence for nobles and commoners? This question is way too big to address here. I will make a series on Byzantine fashion and dress to explain this. The gist, however, is that commoner clothings are pretty much the same everywhere, while for nobles, it evolved due to shifting social attitudes and, of course, neighboring influences. Christianity and its emphasis on modesty, both male and female, brought new changes to fashion, and the Roman dress became much less revealing and more heavily covered as time went on, at least in public. The outside influences shifts with time, as nobles will find it fashionable to adjust their dress accordingly. First, it was the Persians, who brought some stuff like the Persian sleeve and made the Romans appreciate coats more, although they retained their ancient love of cloaks. Then the Arabs, who brought kaftans and the like to the Romans. Then the Turks, who greatly influenced mostly the Romans' riding gear and outfits. I think the developments of the most beautiful hats in the later period might be connected to the Turks as well, but I am not sure of that yet. In any case, keep in mind that hats get crazy by the Paleologan period, and they often could be your only way to distinguish a Roman from other peoples, as by then they have adopted too much of other cultures' dress to be distinguishable at first glance. Like, look at Renaissance paintings of the Greek humanists who fled to Italy. They're almost the same as the Italians, except for the fact that they had larger beards. Some Renaissance painters who painted the impressive official Roman delegations to Italy while seeking union do try to emphasize the differences that those quote-unquote Oriental and exotic Romans have with themselves. And the most noticeable is that of the fancy headwear. But this is an extremely simplified overview. We're mostly looking at the court members in Constantinople. Villagers of other provinces definitely do not look all the same. Keep in mind that Byzantine dress is very diverse. What Roman customs and traditions survived from the early Republic all the way to the Byzantine era, and if any to the end of the Empire? Things like triumphs come to mind. Not necessarily just from the early Republic, but stuff from the ancient Roman period in general would be cool too. Triumphs for sure, although that wasn't around by the end of the Empire because of resources issues and, well, there wasn't a lot to celebrate. The best example of Roman Republican traditions surviving to the end, however, is the law. The law reigned supreme. from the conception of the 12 tables to the exavilos of Constantinos Armenopoulos and the fall of Constantinople. The Romans themselves, of course, continued the Roman legal tradition better than any Latin medieval jurist. There was also a more republican spirit than most other states around them, as Professor Anthony Caldelas argues in his book, The Byzantine Republic. According to him, emperors weren't absolute theocratic despots like some old Orientalist historians believed, but rather, they were chosen representatives of the Roman Senate and people in a hidden, democracy-esque imperial system. No Vasilevs could expect to sit on his throne, even if he was purple-born, if he did not look after the interests of the Roman people and their politia, which means republic or state, and it's a word thrown around quite often in those days. This assured a more meritocratic ruler would always guide the empire, because the Romans were shifty and liked civil wars. If you weren't up to standard, you could be replaced theoretically at any time. Think of the fates of Phokas, overthrown by Heraclius, or the civil wars between Michael II and Thomas the Slav, and Constantinos Monomachos and Leon Tornikius. Justinian was almost overthrown by the will of the people during the Nika riots, but he deviated from the Roman way of just stepping out peacefully and decided to brutally suppress the hooligans. So, whether you buy into Caldelas' theory or not, you could at least concede that the republican spirit has more or less invaded the Byzantine consciousness. I suppose you might want to hear more about daily life customs rather than political traditions, in which case I will be sorry to disappoint you. Customs change a lot based on region and religion, and a pagan republic in central Italy will barely have much in common with a Christian empire on the borders of Europe and Asia. A lot of Byzantine customs and festivities which survived from pre-Christian times trace their roots back to Greek antiquity rather than an Italian-Roman one, which is fair, since the Roman East and West always had some differences. You could find republican or classical origins for some Christian practices, like icon veneration and celebrating Christmas, as the wonderful era of change known as late antiquity adapted some old mores for a new era. But would you consider them the same as they were back in ancient days? This is what happens when a state survives for too long. Too much will change. However, some things, like hygiene awareness, were so ingrained into the Roman mentality that their eternal practice of bathing never died, and taught their conquerors to do the same. That's why Arabs and Turks have such nice hammams. The Paleologan official Nikiforos Komnos claimed that in Thessaloniki there were more baths than citizens. It's a hyperbole, of course, but you can see how bath crazy the Romans were even after decades of occupation by the Latins. It is also in that beautiful second city of the empire that you will find the best preserved Byzantine bath in the world. Unfortunately, the Latinocratia did put a break to many traditions that survived into the medieval era. Therefore, we cannot say that the Hippodrome Games and the Senate lasted until the very end of the empire. What do you think happened to the Senate? On the topic of the Senate, yes, let me briefly explain. When Constantine the Great founded Constantinople, he was aiming for the city to become a real new Rome and established a Senate like the one in Old Rome. He attempted to bring many old Roman nobility over to the east, and that's why you often hear about an origin from Old Rome for many Byzantine aristocratic families. The Senate worked much like the one in Italy, although of course it never reached its power and influence as back in the days of the Republic, because dominant reasons. The title of senator persisted in the Roman government. The Senate convened to talk about state issues. New emperors needed to justify themselves before the Senate, and the last recorded act of the Senate was in 1204, right before the sack of Constantinople by the Latins. But after that, I don't think the Senate ever actually did anything, although the institution and title survived to the Paleologan era. However, from what I read in Pachymeres, they were mostly just present with the emperor and clergy on important events, overseeing debates, etc. Like, look here at this passage in Pachymeres about Andronicus II making a speech to the Senate about an ecclesiastical controversy. And after Pachymeres, that is to say the early Paleologan period, I don't think I've seen other mentions of it. So the Senate either survived to 1453 but just didn't do anything, or it fell out of existence sometime in the 14th century. In any case, I wouldn't be surprised about the gradual decline of this ancient institution, seeing how everything else around the Romans were also falling apart, but very, very slowly, coming off piece by piece. Like the empire, the Senate sort of just faded, I suppose. What was the perception of the populace towards the Western and Eastern barbarians and their differences? Looking through all of Eastern Roman history, that is to say 1,000 years, which is hella more than the lifespans of most states, is not so easy. The Romans changed neighbors many times. They outlived their foes most of the times too. But in general, there is one major Eastern enemy and one Western in every rough period, which spans about 300 or 400 years. And this is the logic that I used to divide my Eastern Rome Samurai series into 3 of those rough periods, based on the different challenges that Romans faced on each front. To simplify it very much, those are respectively, in late antiquity, Persians in the east and Germanic peoples in the west. In the early Middle Ages, Arabs in the east and Bulgars in the west. In the later Middle Ages, Turks in the east and Latins in the west. Keep in mind, please, that this is an incredibly oversimplified version of geopolitical developments, but I am limiting it to just these 6 quote-unquote barbarians to not overload you with details. Even if it seems Romans were very dismissive of every neighboring state and couldn't distinguish for the life of them between a Pecheneg and an August Turk, Scythians, duh, they could still tell general differences. However, as many of you may know already, the very general perception of the Roman populace towards their adversaries in the east is somewhat more elevated than those in the west. Easterners were more worthy of esteem. Their states had similar bureaucratic organizations to that of the Roman Empire. Their wealth and luxury were quite fashionable among the Roman elite. Their ambassadors were received on grander terms. Their battle strategies were more suitable to Roman warfare. In general, Romans treated them with a grudging respect. But of course, that also differed between specifically which Easterner and in what period, and also which part of the populace we're talking about. When did Byzantine culture die? Never. It lives on in our hearts. A more serious answer would be, how do you define Byzantine culture? This was an empire which dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for a millennium. Many cultural practices of the Byzantines were continued in traditional cultures around this area, because, as I like to say, rulers change, but people don't. Greeks, and especially those who lived in Constantinople and around, like the Thrakiotes, Micrasiates, etc., of course retained the highest amount of Byzantine culture in theirs. But to a small degree, a huge number of people, whether those directly ruled by Byzantines or just in their commonwealth, are left with a piece of Byzantine culture. Do the millions of Orthodox Christians all over the world not keep Byzantine ecclesiastical culture alive in their days? Even when a believer from Alaska pronounces the Lord's Prayer in English, they are still speaking with the same conviction and faith as a Roman from Constantinople 1000 years ago. Do Balkaners, Anatolians, and Levantines not also maintain much of Byzantine secular culture in their own? Do they not play some descendants of the Byzantine lira, tamburas, lauto, and other instruments? Do some of their churches and mosques not draw inspiration from Byzantine architectural marvels like the Hagia Sophia? Is the Koptoplacus not the ancestor of the modern baklava, which nationalists from the region will literally die to claim, but ignore that they are continuing a Byzantine dessert culture? And most importantly, do not all of us around the world uphold Byzantine legal culture, as most of our law codes are based upon Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis? I could go on and on, but I think my point is made sufficiently clear. Byzantine culture is more long-lasting than we think. It just infiltrated our daily lives in such a sneaky manner that we often forget to credit our medieval Roman friends. Okay, that's enough yapping for one Q&A. I hope you're ready for another round like this soon. See you and take care.